أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I seek refuge in our Creator and Sustainer from all the negativity and evil suggestions of Satan. I begin in the name of Allah, the indiscriminately compassionate, the infinitely merciful. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I greet you all with the universal greetings of peace. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon you. Firstly, I want to thank you once again for making some time, or taking time out of your valuable time to participate in this workshop. Before we start, again, there's just a few things that I need to mention. We'd like your participation to be safe and anonymous if you choose to be anonymous. So keep your video off and keep your microphone on silent. And if you need to use a pseudonym, please do so. The session will be recorded for those who are not able to make the workshop during this time. So just be aware of that. And the link to the recording will also be made available to you once we have finished this workshop. You may ask questions during the course of the presentation. You can just send them through through the chat. I may not be able to answer all of them, but I'll try my best. And then also there will be time in between the presentations for some questions and for some of your comments as well. So this is going to be a 2-hour session, and at the end we request that you just answer a few simple questions just to satisfy our donors. They would like to see the impact of our work, so your feedback will make it possible for more workshops like this to be run in the future, inshallah. Then in terms of references, the reason why I first did the Islam, understanding Islam as a compassion-centered and all-inclusive faith, it's because some of the stuff that I'll be doing today, you will then understand why we needed to talk about Islam first in that particular way. So this workshop is slightly loaded with information, but I have put as many references as possible on the slide, so you can also then go and do your own research. There's a lot to discuss when it comes to Islam, sexual orientation, and gender identity, and I don't think we'll be able to do justice to that in just 2 hours. So I'm going to try my best to just focus on these 4 areas, which is homoeroticism in early Islam, Muslim responses to LGBTIQ, so those are temporary, contemporary responses, a study of the Muhannathun community in the time of the Prophet is useful because there are similarities and also there are distinct things about this community, but it's useful to see how the Nabi Muhammad ﷺ treated the Muhannathun community and how we should be treating the LGBTIQ community. And then since the story of Qawmul Lut, or the people of Prophet Lot, is being used as a blanket condemnation for homosexuality in Islam and in Christianity and Orthodox Judaism, it would be useful to unpack that story and see what was the actual reason why Allah recorded that story in the Quran and what are the lessons we're supposed to take out from there. So let's look at homoeroticism in our history and early Islam, especially in the Golden Period, which is the 7th to the 9th century. So we see that these kind of artifacts and carvings that were discovered in caves are actually now found in certain museums. Like, for example, in the museum in Berlin, there's this piece and it depicts same-sex eroticism or sexual encounter between 2 males. And this was found in caves and on pottery in the Mesopotamian region and also in early Persia. Then we look at these 2 paintings over here. This is a very common event that was held during the golden period of Islam. It's called Shuhbat. It is a festival in the garden where mukhannathun, and these are the effeminate men, and I'll just call them effeminate men for now, for lack of a better word, but they were invited to come to these events to read poetry, to play their music, and then also provide sexual favors to the masters. And the masters you can see are those Arab elites that's sitting there and listening to the poetry. And here at the bottom you see in red a mukhannath dancing for one of the princes. There is another two, mukhannath sitting in the middle of the stage and reciting its poetry. And the one at the bottom is actually a painting on a door of the famous Abu Nawas. He was the famous mukhannath of the 9th century, very well known in the time of Harun al-Rashid. And he had a love affair with the son of Harun al-Rashid, Muhammad al-Amin. He's the one with the cap on, and Abu Nawas is the one with the curl, because Abu Nawas, let me just let more people in. Okay. Abu Nawas, that was not his real name, that was his laqab, his nickname. And Nawas means curls, and Abu Nawas is the father of the curls. And he started this tradition of these mukhannathun wearing these turbans, and then they would stick the curls out on the side, kind of indicating that they were available and that they were mukhannathun. All right, let's go to the next one. This was also very common. We see much later in the early 17th century that Arabs used to, more specifically Arabs than the Persians, would capture these Caucasian boys as Islam was spreading into Europe, capture these beautiful Caucasian boys, dress them up in feminine attire, and then add them to their harems, right? And these boys also needed to provide sexual favors. And Arabs were very, and I think pretty much today still are very fond of fair complexion and so on. So that's, and moving on to Sufi Islam, we also see there's quite a few same-sex love stories within Sufi Islam. Often it is between the sheikh and the student. There's this love relationship between Rumi and Shams. Another one is between Shah Hussein and Madullah. And there were also some in India during the Mughal periods. And I'm sure if you Google it, you'll stumble upon a few others as well. There's a better picture of Abu Nawas, or the Mukhannathun, and they were servants, so he's depicted as a servant there. And then we also find, besides these paintings and poetry, that there are numerous of these poetry and specifically erotic poetry found between the 7th and the 9th century. Abu Nawas wrote a lot about them. Muhammad al-Amin also wrote some of them, and many others. And we see how this homoerotic poetry was actually celebrated in Arab culture at the time. It was only towards the mid-12th century that Muslims started becoming a little bit more homophobic. And we'll look at that a little bit later. And the kind of poetry was always in praise of the beardless boy, the young boy whose beard is just beginning to sprout, and very sexually provocative stuff. Let me just admit some more. Okay. Right. And then we see also when we look at the Quran, which is another poetic masterpiece, that the Quran also doesn't fall short of mentioning same-sex love. For example, in 2 verses of the Quran, Allah would say, وَيَطُوفُ عَلَيْهِمْ غِلْمَانٌ لَهُمْ كَأَنَّهُمْ لُؤْلُؤٌ مَكْنُونٌ, that round about them will serve devoted to them young boys as pearls well guarded. And in another verse, it says, وَيَطُوفُ عَلَيْهِمْ وِلْدَانٌ مُخَلَّدُونَ. Now, both these words in blue, it's indisputably in the masculine form. So some Orthodox scholars want to wish it away and say, no, it's just referring to servants, but it's clearly in the masculine form. And these kind of verses were sort of, sent down to a community that was engaging in same-sex love, kind of promising them that if they are good and, they are, Allah conscious, then Allah will give them even something better than what they have now, which is these perpetual youths serving them as handsome young or pearls well guarded. Then if we look at hadith, we also get some more evidence there. The following hadith are considered by most major scholars of hadith, such as Bukhari, Imam Muslim, Yahya bin Ma'in, Ibn Hazm, and many others, as fabricated. And it's quite interesting that when we listen to hadith, maybe that is being recited to us in the masjid, nobody quotes the classification of these hadith, or even stating the chain of narrators, whatever. So it is important that when we look at these hadith and when we hear them, is to insist on who narrated it, and which scholars have declared it as fabricated or an ahad hadith, meaning a singular hadith, and so on. So we see most of these hadith that are used to condemn homosexuals are actually considered as either fabricated or weak hadith by most of these major scholars that I've just mentioned. Now let's look at some of them. The first one says, narrated Abdullah ibn Abbas, that the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, if anyone has sexual intercourse with an animal, you must kill him and kill the animal, right? And Ikramah, he apparently asked, I asked Ibn Abbas, what offense can be attributed to the animal? And he replied, I think the Prophet disapproved of his flesh being eaten when such a thing has been done unto it. So obviously referring to animals that Muslims can eat. But then just in the very same breath, the same person, Abdullah ibn Abbas, mentions that, let me just add more people to the room, mentions that there is no prescribed punishment for having sexual intercourse with an animal. So which one do you choose, right? And along the same lines, the same has been said about 2 men having sex with each other. Whoever you find committing the sin of the people of Lut, and it is assumed that the sin of the people of Lut here is anal sex, you should kill the one who does it and the one to whom it is done. That has been recorded in Tirmidhi, but Imams like Imam Bukhari, Imam Muslim, Yahya bin Ma'in, Ibn Hazm, and many others, and even contemporary muhaddithin have sort of impugned this hadith and declared it inauthentic. Cool. People are coming in late. Let me just check if there's more people in the waiting room. Okay. Right, let's move along. Then here is another hadith, 2 hadiths following each other, indicating that they were muhannathun, or effeminate men, or castrated men, or eunuchs as they used to call them, that was working in the houses of the wives of the Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Salma was one who reported that she had a muhannat as a slave, And then one day when they were sitting sort of, in the house, having a conversation with one another, this Muhannad then addressed Salma's brother, Abdullah bin Abu Umayyah, and he said to them, if you are going to take victory over Taif tomorrow, then I should show you the daughter of Ghailan, who was the ruler at the time. She has 4 folds on her front of her stomach and 8 folds on her back. And Allah's Messenger, peace be upon him, heard this and he said, such should not visit you. Right. Now, this hadith is often used by Orthodox Muslim scholars as a sort of justification for throwing gay people out of their houses. But you see, when we look at the context of this hadith, the person's sexual orientation doesn't come into question here. The reason why the Nabi Muhammad did not want this person to enter into Salma's house was because, firstly, you do not speak in a very sexual manner in front of the Prophet. That would be disrespectful. Secondly, there were cases of people that were imitating the Muhannathun, pretending that they were Muhannathun, just so that they could have access to the female's quarters. And so he could have possibly been an imposter. And thirdly, if we look at the next verse, in fact, the one that's related by Aisha radiallahu anha, she reported something very similar. And I think it is probably the same story. And she added a little bit saying that the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that I see that he knows these things, right? He knows the sensuality of a woman. And so therefore allow him not to enter, right? So, and then Aisha radiallahu anha says that after that, they started to observe veil in front of him. So it's possible that he could have been bisexual also, right? Because he knew the sensualities and so on of women. Right, but certainly it doesn't speak about sexual orientation at all, so it cannot be used as a hadith to condemn homosexuals. Another one says, narrated on the authority of Abdullah ibn Abbas, that the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, whoever you find committing the sin of the people of Lut, again assuming that it is anal sex, kill the one who does it and the one to whom it is done. Here we see very clearly that this hadith is only recorded by Imam Ahmad, Imam Abu Dawud and Tirmidhi, but Al-Bukhari, Yahya bin Ma'in and Nasai ibn Hazm, they have not included this hadith in their collections because they believe that it was fabricated. Abu Huraira reported something similar, and he apparently said that the Prophet said you should stone the upper and the lower person who's committing the act. Again, this hadith was recorded only by Ibn Majah, Abu Ya'la and Al-Hakim, but Tirmidhi, Ibn Hazm and many others have also declared this hadith inauthentic. And in his book Ahkam al-Quran, the judge Abu Bakr al-Jassas, who was the famous 9th century judge, he actually stated that these hadith that's calling for the punishment of homosexuals are not reliable by any means, and no legal punishment can be prescribed based on them. So it's not contemporary scholars that are saying this. This is a 9th century scholar who has already at that time passed his fatwa, if you could put it like that, or his ra'i, his personal opinion, that these hadith cannot be used against homosexuals. Another hadith, the Prophet, peace be upon him, apparently said, may Allah curse the one who does the act of the people of Lut, and he apparently repeated it 3 times. This hadith again is considered Hasan. It was considered acceptable, but only by one scholar, Shu'aib al-Arnaut, in his Tahqiq al-Musnad, and many others again like Bukhari, Ibn Majah, Abu Dawud. They all disagreed that this hadith was authentic. I hope that you're already starting to see the picture about all these hadith that are, reported or purported sayings of the Prophet. And it's also been recorded by At-Tirmidhi and Ibn Majah on the authority of Jabir ibn Abdullah that the Messenger of Allah said, what I fear most for my ummah is the behavior of the people of Lut. Again, the behavior is assumed to be only engaging in anal sex. However, when we later look at the Quran, we will see the amount of atrocities that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah or Qawm Lut had engaged in. So we can't just reduce it to one act, right? So even this hadith was classified as weak by hadith scholars such as Al-Bukhari, Muslim, and An-Nasai. And also, as I mentioned, the behavior of the people of Lut was not homosexuality, but rather the abuse of power, and therefore all these atrocities that they've committed comes down to the abuse of power and privilege. Another hadith, if one man says to another, "Oh, effeminate one, give him 20 lashes," and if one man says to the other, "Oh, homosexual, give him also 20 lashes." Now we see that in the Arabic text, the word luti appears here, and how luti has now suddenly become homosexual, when luti originally was referring only to anal sex or sodomy, right? So we also see how things are being misinterpreted or misrepresented when it comes to the translation. So there are also some weak hadiths purporting that after the Prophet, peace be upon him, demise, some individuals whose names are not mentioned were executed. There's an example. The Khalif Abu Bakr, apparently, he executed some mukhannathun, but their names are not mentioned, and you don't find them written up anywhere in our history. And apparently also Ali bin Abi Talib, he said that he's to have ordered the death by stoning for another sodomite. But again, the names are not mentioned. So one kind of wonders if this is really true. Then narrated by Ibn Abbas to his servant Ikrama, this is also an Ahad hadith. When the male mounts another male, the angels are alarmed and they raise a cry to their Lord. The wrath of the Mighty One comes down upon them. The curse comes over them and the tempters surround them. The earth asks its Lord for permission to swallow them up, and the divine throne grows heavy upon those who bear it up, while the angels declare God's greatness and hellfire rears up high. So I find this a little bit, humorous, because when we understand Allah, the might of Allah, Allah's compassion, Allah's sovereign power, to think that two men on earth having anal sex with one another could actually shake the throne of Allah, it really doesn't make sense. But then when you look at it or delve in it a little bit further, we find that Ikrama is considered by many as an unreliable transmitter of hadith. Ibn Qayyim, he held the view that the transmission of this hadith was weak and may have been fabricated. And then the Yemeni scholar Ash-Shawkani, in his collection of fabricated hadith, also holds the view that this hadith is fabricated. Despite this weak hadith and the chain of narrators, the context of this hadith is also questionable. And yet you will find contemporary scholars who will still use this hadith to condemn homosexuals. According to most Orthodox Muslim scholars, a person who has committed sodomy or anal sex should be stoned to death. Their argument is based on these hadith that we have just quoted. Bukhari did not consider any of these hadith related to the stoning of death for anal sex as authentic, and therefore he did not include it in his collection. Also, Imam Muslim have not included it in his collections, and incidentally, these are supposed to be the two authentic compilations of hadith. Scholars such as Abu Bakr al-Jassas, and then also the 12th century scholar Imam al-Nawawi, and many of his contemporaries, they also did not believe that these hadith can be used as punishment for homosexuality. Right? Now that's very important, because we see that after the 12th century, right, or let's say from 7th century Arabia up to the 12th century, Muslims were not homophobic. There was all this eroticism that happening in Arabia. You know, there was the do and don't tell attitude. There were no punishment of homosexuals. Erotic poetry have survived in that time. And then suddenly after the 12th century, we see homophobia sort of bleeding within the Muslim community. So, Dr. Edward A. Lacey, who did a research on the attitudes towards homosexuality in the Umayyad and the Abbasid dynasties, he actually translated the work of Ahmad bin Yusuf al-Tifashi, and his conclusion was that during the Umayyad period, he calls it the relaxed Umayyad period, and the more permissive Abbasid dynasties, which ruled after the Nabi Muhammad passed away, there were no punishments of poets for their explicit and homoerotic poetry, for their public sexual opinions, or even for their sexual activities. He says, at all events, homosexuality seems to have been widely practiced and accepted under these two dynasties, as it is also in most Muslim countries today, right? So most Muslim countries today, homosexuality is rife. Men have sex with men. It's the just do and don't tell rule that still applies. Right? So before we go on to the Quran, I just want us to take about 3 minutes just to reflect on some of these questions, and you're welcome to type them into the chat, and we'll see if we can engage with it for a few minutes, right? So what are your feelings around same-sex love in the history of Islam? Is this new to you? Did you know that they existed? What's your opinion about that? And what's your opinion about using hadith as punishment for homosexuals? And besides the Muslim community, do you think that there were also other communities or other cultures that have celebrated same-sex love? Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I have only given you a little bit of evidence, but there's still much more that demonstrate that homosexuality um, was celebrated in our Islamic history. Absolutely. I also struggle with the hadith that talks about the Prophet cursing other people, and yet there is a hadith also that where the Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam himself says that Muslims shouldn't curse one another. So there is that contradiction. Yeah. I find it difficult to believe that such a compassionate prophet could, and an inclusive prophet could curse others. I think the question, how did homosexuals live during those times? Was it an open lifestyle? If you look at the Mukhannathun community, it was pretty much an accepted community at the time. And just like you find a lot of the LGBTIQ people today involved in the entertainment industry, it was pretty much similar to that. They were part of the music, part of the poetry, and very much visible in society. Okay, right. So thank you for your questions and your comments. I'm not able to go through all of them. So let's continue to the next section. So let's look at